The text message read that my perfect match was waiting at table 4. But the men laughing loudly at that table were not blind dates. They were a cruel, calculated trap set by my own twin sister. That was the night my public humiliation was supposed to break me. Instead, it was the night the ruthless head of the Chicago underworld decided I was his. The rain over Chicago did nothing to wash away the anxiety gripping Federica Mancini as she stepped into the opulent foyer of the Obsidian Lounge. She smoothed the emerald silk of her dress, a garment she had saved for months to purchase. It draped beautifully over her plus-sized figure, clinging to her curves in a way that made her feel, for once, powerful rather than overlooked. Federica was not naive. She knew the world was often unkind to women who took up space, women who did not fit the sharp, skeletal molds of high society. But tonight was supposed to be different. Her identical twin sister, Celeste Falcone, had arranged this blind date. The fact that they were twins was a biological technicality they rarely discussed. Where Federica had inherited their grandmother's soft, statuesque build and dark, observant eyes, Celeste had spent her entire adult life surgically and cosmetically altering herself to erase any trace of their shared lineage. Celeste had also erased their shared name, marrying into the notorious Falcone crime syndicate and adopting their moniker like a crown of thorns. Federica had stayed away, building a quiet, respectable life as a forensic archivist and financial auditor for the city. Yet when Celeste called earlier that week, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, promising that she knew a man who would appreciate Federica for exactly who she was, a foolish sliver of hope had pierced Federica's defenses. Blood was blood, or so she had thought. The maitre d' led her to a secluded booth near the back of the dimly lit, velvet-draped restaurant. Federica ordered a glass of red wine and waited. 15 minutes bled into 30. The ice in her water glass melted. She kept her posture straight, her chin held high, refusing to let the familiar sting of rejection show on her face. She was used to being the reliable, invisible sister. She possessed a deep, unshakable resilience forged in the fires of a lifetime of quiet dismissals. She would finish her wine, pay her tab, and walk out with her dignity intact. That was when the laughter started. 3 men approached her booth. They were dressed in expensive but poorly tailored suits, smelling of cheap cologne and stale cigar smoke. They did not look like men looking for romance. They looked like hyenas circling a wounded animal. The tallest one, a man with a jagged scar near his jaw, slammed a heavy hand down on her table, rattling her wine glass. He looked her up and down, his mouth twisting into a cruel, mocking sneer. "So this is the prize Celeste promised us," the scarred man barked, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. "She said you were a heavy load. But damn, sweetheart, I think we are going to need a bigger booth. Maybe a reinforced chair." The other 2 men erupted into harsh, braying laughter. The sound sliced through the elegant ambience of the restaurant. Diners turned to stare. Whispers broke out like small fires. Federica felt a cold wash of realization flood her veins. There was no blind date. There was no man who appreciated her. This was a spectacle, a prank designed by Celeste to humiliate her in one of the most exclusive venues in Chicago. Celeste wanted to break her spirit, perhaps as payback for Federica refusing to manipulate some financial records for the Falcone family earlier that month. A lesser woman might have dissolved into tears. A lesser woman might have fled the restaurant, covering her face in shame. But Federica Mancini did not run. She possessed a quiet, lethal strength. She calmly set down her wine glass, her hand completely steady. She looked the scarred man dead in the eye, her gaze as cold and unyielding as Arctic ice. "You are blocking my light," Federica said, her voice steady and perfectly modulated, carrying just enough authority to make the man blink in surprise. "And given the cheap polyester blend of your suit, you are also offending my senses. I suggest you walk away before you embarrass yourselves further." The scarred man recovered from his shock, his face flushing dark red with anger. "You have got a lot of nerve, pig. You think you can talk to us like that? Celeste paid us good money to show you exactly where you belong." He reached out, his thick fingers grabbing her wrist. The grip was tight, painful, meant to intimidate. Federica did not flinch, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She calculated the distance to her steak knife, wondering if she could reach it before he snapped her arm. Before she could move, the temperature in the restaurant seemed to plummet. The low hum of conversation across the dining room died instantly. The silence that fell was heavy, suffocating, and reeked of sudden, absolute terror. The scarred man froze, his grip on Federica loosening as a shadow fell over their table. "Let go of her." The voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. It carried the chilling, unquestionable authority of a man who commanded life and death on a daily basis. Federica looked up. Standing behind the three thugs was a man who looked like he had been carved from Italian marble and tempered in hellfire. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that clung to a broad, muscular frame. His face was a study in ruthless geometry, all sharp jawline and piercing, obsidian eyes that locked onto the man holding Federica. It was Ettore Moretti. Even isolated in her world of ledgers and archives, Federica knew exactly who he was. Everyone in Chicago knew who he was. Ettore Moretti was the undisputed boss of the Moretti Syndicate, the most powerful and ruthless mafia family in the Midwest. He was a phantom, a myth wrapped in violence and immense wealth. And he was staring at the man, touching her as if deciding how slowly to peel the skin from his bones. The three men scrambled backward, as if they had been burned. The scarred man practically tripped over his own feet, his previous bravado evaporating into pure, unadulterated panic. "Mr. Moretti," the man stammered, his face draining of all color. "We didn't know. We were just doing a joke. A favor for Celeste Falcone." Ettore did not look at the men. His dark, consuming gaze was fixed entirely on Federica. He took in her flushed cheeks, her steady posture, and the faint red mark forming on her pale wrist where the thug had grabbed her. Something dark and possessive flared in his eyes, a terrifying intensity that made the breath catch in Federica's throat. "A joke," Ettore repeated, his voice smooth and deadly as a straight razor. "You think a woman like this is a punchline. You think you are worthy to even breathe the same air as her." He snapped his fingers. It was a microscopic movement, but immediately 4 massive men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the restaurant. They moved with blunt, lethal efficiency, flanking the 3 thugs. "Take them outside," Ettore commanded softly, his eyes never leaving Federica. "Teach them how to properly respect a lady. And send a message to Celeste Falcone. Tell her if she ever attempts to touch what is mine again, I will burn her entire house down with her inside it." The thugs were dragged away, whimpering and pleading, but their voices were quickly muffled. The restaurant remained dead silent. No one dared to look directly at Ettore. Federica sat frozen as Ettore Moretti slid into the booth opposite her. He moved with the grace of a predatory cat, settling into the plush velvet. Up close, the sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. He smelled of rich espresso, cedar, and gunpowder. "You did not cry," Ettore stated, breaking the silence between them. It was not a question. It was an observation, spoken with deep reverence. "I do not waste tears on cheap suits and petty women," Federica replied, keeping her voice level, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She refused to cower, even before the most dangerous man in the city. "But I admit, I am confused, Mr. Moretti. Why would the head of the Moretti syndicate intervene in a cruel sisterly prank?" Ettore leaned forward, bridging the distance between them. "Because you are not a prank, Federica. You are a masterpiece, and I have been watching you for a very long time." Federica frowned, her sharp mind racing. "Watching me? Why?" "I am an auditor. I live quietly. I have nothing to do with your world or Celeste's." "That is where you are wrong," Ettore said softly, reaching across the table. He did not ask for permission. He gently took her hand, his large calloused fingers tracing the red mark on her wrist with agonizing tenderness. The contrast between his known brutality and his gentle touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "Your sister, Celeste, married into the Falcone family to gain power," Ettore continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. "But the Falcones are bleeding money. They are sloppy. 2 months ago, you audited a shell company for the city, a waste management firm. You flagged it for embezzlement and froze their municipal contracts." Federica's eyes widened. "That was routine. I found discrepancies in their offshore routing. You crippled their main revenue stream," Ettore corrected, a faint, proud smile touching his lips. "You did with a red pen what my enforcers have been trying to do with bullets for 6 months. Celeste found out it was you. She set up this humiliation tonight to break your confidence, to make you vulnerable so the Falcones could leverage you into unfreezing those assets. She wanted to record this, send it to your superiors, and prove you were mentally unstable." A cold fury replaced the initial shock in Federica's chest. Celeste had always been vain and cruel, but this was a new level of depravity. She had tried to destroy Federica's career, her sanctuary, all for Mafia money. "And you intervened out of gratitude?" Federica asked, pulling her hand back slightly. She needed to maintain her boundaries. This man was a predator, even if he was currently acting as a shield. Ettore did not let her go. Instead, his grip tightened just enough to keep her tethered to him, his thumb soothing the sensitive skin of her palm. "Gratitude is for business partners," he murmured, his eyes darkening with an obsession that made her heart pound wildly. "I intervened because you belong to me, Federica. You have belonged to me since the day I saw you walking out of the municipal archives in the pouring rain, refusing an umbrella, holding your ground against the storm. I saw your strength. I saw the brilliant, beautiful woman the rest of this blind, foolish city ignores." Federica felt a flush creep up her neck. Men did not speak to her this way. They certainly did not look at her as if they wanted to devour her and worship her simultaneously. She was a plus-sized woman who loved old books and complex financial algorithms. She was not the heroine of a dark, underworld romance. "Mr. Moretti," she started, trying to inject some rationality into the conversation. Ettore, she amended, her voice trembling slightly. "I appreciate the rescue, but I do not belong to anyone. I am going home now." Ettore stood up smoothly, bringing her up with him. His large hand moved to the small of her back, a proprietary heat sinking through the silk of her dress. "You are going home," he agreed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But you are going to my home. The Falcones know you are on to them now. Celeste failed tonight, which means they will try something violent tomorrow. I will not allow a single hair on your head to be harmed. I can take care of myself, Federica insisted, planting her feet. I know you can, my fierce, brilliant girl, Ettore whispered, leaning down so his lips brushed the shell of her ear. He breathed in her scent, a soft groan escaping his chest. But you do not have to anymore. Let me be the monster that guards your door. Before Federica could process the sheer weight of his words, Ettore was guiding her through the restaurant. The patrons parted like the Red Sea, averting their eyes out of respect and fear. Out on the street, a convoy of black armored SUVs was waiting, the rain slicking the dark metal. Ettore opened the door to the lead vehicle himself. He looked back at her, the neon lights of Chicago reflecting in his dark eyes, revealing a depth of hunger and protection that shook Federica to her very foundation. Get in, Federica. Our war with the Falcones just became personal. And I promise you, by the time we are done, your sister will be the one begging for mercy. Federica looked at the rain, looked at the dangerous, captivating man offering her his hand, and stepped into the shadows. Ettore's compound in Lake Forest was less of a home and more of a heavily militarized fortress disguised as a sprawling stone manor. For 3 days, Federica was confined to the East Wing, surrounded by priceless art, mahogany furniture, and men carrying concealed firearms. Ettore had given her the master suite, a cavernous room overlooking the restless grey waters of Lake Michigan. He treated her not as a prisoner, but as a queen holding court. He had a custom wardrobe delivered, filled with luxurious fabrics, tailored specifically for her plus-sized figure, a stark contrast to the cheap insults Celeste had hurled her way at the restaurant. But Federica was a woman of action, not a delicate porcelain doll meant to be kept on a shelf. She was used to working long hours, unraveling financial knots that baffled lesser minds. On the 4th morning, she walked into Ettore's private study, bypassing 2 massive guards who looked terrified to stop her. She did not ask for permission. She simply pushed the heavy double doors open. Ettore was seated behind a massive oak desk, reviewing shipping manifests. When he saw her, the hard, lethal lines of his face softened instantly. He stood, his dark eyes sweeping over the deep burgundy wrap dress she wore. It hugged her curves flawlessly, emphasizing her soft, statuesque build. "You are breathtaking," he murmured, walking around the desk. His voice was a physical weight in the room, commanding and utterly devoted. "Are you comfortable? Do you need anything else?" "I need a secure laptop, access to the dark web, and the financial ledgers of the Falcone syndicate," Federica demanded, crossing her arms over her chest. Ettore stopped, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated worship. Most women in her position would be cowering, begging to go back to their quiet, normal lives. Federica was asking for ammunition. "And what exactly will my beautiful auditor do with that?" he asked, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His knuckles brushed her cheek, leaving a trail of fire that made her breath hitch. "Celeste tried to break me by making me feel small," Federica said, her voice steady and resolute. "She thinks power only comes from violence or cruel high society games. But money is the real blood of Chicago. You said I crippled their waste management front. I want to finish the job. Give me their accounts, Ettore. I will bleed the Falcones dry from this desk." Ettore let out a low, rough laugh that sent shivers down her spine. He pulled her flush against his solid chest. She felt the heavy warmth of him, the hard muscles beneath his tailored shirt, and the cold steel of the weapon holstered at his side. He leaned down, his lips brushing her jawline. "You are going to be the absolute ruin of my enemies," he whispered fiercely. Within an hour, Ettore had set up a command center for her in the study, while his enforcers waged a physical war on the streets of the South Side, raiding Falcone warehouses and intercepting their weapons shipments along the docks. Federica waged a silent, devastating war on the digital front. She was a savant with numbers. She traced shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, unraveled complex money laundering schemes tied to high-end real estate in the Loop, and identified the corrupt politicians on the Falcone payroll. With a few keystrokes, she froze assets, rerouted hidden funds into dummy accounts controlled by the Moretti family, and forwarded anonymous dossiers of hard evidence to the FBI. She worked with a ruthless efficiency that mirrored Ettore's own brutality on the streets. Over the next 2 weeks, the Falcone syndicate began to collapse. Without money to pay their soldiers or bribe the police, their power crumbled. Safe houses were abandoned. Lieutenants defected to the Moretti side to save their own lives. Celeste's husband, the nominal head of the Falcones, was forced into hiding. Ettore watched her work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He brought her meals himself, refusing to let the staff interrupt her focus. He would sit in the leather armchair across from her desk, drinking expensive whiskey and watching the fierce concentration on her face. To him, her mind was as intoxicating as her body. He had spent his life surrounded by people who feared him or wanted to use him. Federica simply matched him. One evening, as heavy rain lashed against the study windows, Federica finalized the massive offshore transfer that bankrupted Celeste's personal slush fund. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms, exhausted but triumphant. Ettore was beside her in an instant. He pulled her up from the chair and hoisted her onto the edge of the heavy oak desk. He stepped between her thighs, his hands gripping her waist with possessive strength. "It is done," she breathed, looking down into his dark, consuming eyes. "The Falcones have nothing left." Ettore did not look at the computer screen. He only looked at her. "You are a terrifying creature, Federica, and you are entirely mine." He crashed his mouth onto hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry claiming. Federica gasped, her hands tangling in his dark hair as she pulled him closer. She tasted whiskey and raw, ill-filtered power. For years, she had felt too big, too loud, too much for the world. But in Ettore's arms, she realized she was exactly enough. He devoured her curves, his large hands mapping her body with a reverence that made her head spin. He worshipped the very flesh the rest of the world had told her to hide. But their sanctuary was about to be breached. The attack came 3 nights later. A desperate, dying animal is always the most dangerous, and the Falcone family was bleeding out. Celeste, driven mad by the sudden loss of her wealth, her status, and her power, had managed to rally a handful of loyal, heavily armed hitmen for a suicide run on the Moretti estate. She wanted the one thing that had orchestrated her downfall. She wanted her sister. The perimeter alarms shrieked at 3 in the morning, shattering the quiet of the estate. Federica jolted awake in the master suite to the sound of distant, echoing gunfire. Ettore was already out of bed, strapping a Kevlar vest over his chest and chambering a round into his sleek black assault rifle. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying violence. "Stay in this room," Ettore commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth. It was the voice of the ruthless mob boss, the undisputed executioner of Chicago. "The door is reinforced steel. Do not open it for anyone but me." Federica nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her mind remained razor-sharp. As Ettore slipped out into the hallway, plunging the manor into a tactical blackout, Federica did not hide under the covers. She moved to the backup terminal Ettore had installed in the bedroom for her. Through the estate's internal security cameras, she watched the chaos unfold in the heavy rain. Celeste's men had breached the outer gates using explosives and were now pinned down in the front courtyard by Ettore's highly trained guards. But Federica noticed a secondary team, led by a woman with striking, surgically enhanced features that mirrored Federica's own. Celeste. Celeste was bypassing the main firefight, using the old service tunnels that led directly to the East Wing. She was coming for Federica, and she was bringing 2 heavily armed mercenaries with her. Federica grabbed the heavy brass fire poker from the stone hearth. She was not a trained killer, but she was a survivor. She positioned herself behind the reinforced door, gripping the cold brass tightly. Minutes later, she heard the electronic lock beep. Celeste had brought a hacker to bypass the security protocols. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open slowly. Celeste stepped into the dimly lit room, holding a suppressed pistol. She looked ragged, her designer clothes torn and soaked with rain, her manicured facade shattered by pure desperation. The 2 mercenaries flanked her, scanning the dark room with their weapons raised. "Where are you, you miserable, fat cow?" Celeste spat into the darkness, her voice trembling with unhinged rage. "You ruined my life. You took my money. You took everything from me." Federica stepped out from the shadows, her posture completely straight, the heavy fire poker gripped in her hands. "I took nothing that belonged to you, Celeste. I only took back what you stole from this city. And I am tired of you thinking you can bully me." Celeste raised the gun, a vicious, triumphant smile twisting her face. "Goodbye, sister." Before Celeste could pull the trigger, a massive figure materialized in the doorway behind the mercenaries. Ettore moved with terrifying, preternatural speed. He dispatched the first mercenary with a brutal strike to the throat, the man dropping silently to the floor. He shot the second mercenary point blank in the chest before the man could even turn around. Celeste screamed, whirling around to face him. Ettore grabbed her wrist, twisting it until a sickening crack echoed in the room. Celeste dropped the gun, wailing in agony. Ettore threw her against the far wall like a rag doll. He raised his own weapon, aiming directly at Celeste's head. His eyes were completely dead, devoid of any mercy or hesitation. She had threatened his queen. There was only one penalty for that in his world. "Ettore, wait," Federica said, her voice cutting sharply through the tension. Ettore froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. He looked at Federica, his broad chest heaving. "She asked for your life," he rasped, his voice rough with adrenaline. "I will not let her keep hers." Federica walked forward, her presence commanding the blood-soaked room. She looked down at her twin sister, the woman who had spent a lifetime trying to erase her. Celeste was sobbing uncontrollably, cradling her broken wrist, shrinking back against the expensive wallpaper in absolute terror. "Killing her is too easy," Federica said coldly, staring down at her twin. "It makes her a martyr to whatever remnants of her syndicate are left out there." She turned to Ettore, her dark, intelligent eyes locking with his. "The police are 5 minutes away. I triggered the silent alarm and sent the FBI task force all the evidence tying Celeste directly to the municipal hits and the embezzlement. If she dies, she escapes justice. If she lives, she spends the rest of her life in a 6x8 federal cell, stripped of her designer clothes, her money, and her stolen name. Let her rot in obscurity. It is what she fears most." Ettore stared at Federica, processing her words. Slowly, The murderous rage in his eyes gave way to a deep, awestruck pride. He lowered his weapon. He stepped over the whimpering form of Celeste and pulled Federica into his arms, crushing her against him. "You are a vicious, brilliant monster," he whispered against her hair, breathing in her scent as police sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing over the lake. "I am an auditor," Federica corrected, a faint smirk touching her lips as she rested her head against his chest. "I just balance the scales." When the authorities breached the estate, they found Celeste Falcone weeping on the floor, waiting to be arrested. Ettore and Federica stood quietly by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the red and blue lights paint the rain-soaked grounds. Ettore wrapped his strong arm around her waist, his grip tight and infinitely possessive. The Falcone name was officially erased from Chicago, replaced entirely by the shadow of the Moretti Syndicate. But Ettore knew the truth. The real power in the city did not reside in his guns or his soldiers. It resided in the beautiful, brilliant woman standing beside him, the woman who had taken a cruel prank and turned it into an empire. He kissed the top of her head, the brutal mob boss completely tamed by the forensic accountant. The blind date had been a trap, but it was Ettore who had been caught, completely and willingly, in her inescapable web. Wow, what a thrilling journey of revenge, power, and unexpected romance. Federica proved that true strength and beauty come from within, and nobody crosses a brilliant mind and a fiercely protective mafia boss. If you loved